All right, next we're going to apply the phenomenological method again, but this time to the word religion, the idea of religion. And we're going to look at four different theorists, four great scholars, namely Paul Tillich, William James, Jonathan Z. Smith, and Thomas Tweed. The first step, as you know, is to identify our perspectival starting point. So, in this case, you already know me and where I'm coming from, that sort of thing. But let's try and investigate our motives. Why are we doing this? Or let's remind ourselves why we are doing this. Not just why we are studying religion, but why are we doing this phenomenology of the word religion? Why look at so many different theorists? First, anytime someone attempts to define the word religion, they're going to leave some things out, right? Everybody's going to kind of come at it from their own perspective. That's the whole logic and idea behind the phenomenological method, is we all come at things from different perspectives, so it's good to get a multiplicity of perspectives. But also each one of us has particular biases. You know, as we talked about before when I mentioned John Hennels comes at it as sort of an avowed atheist and somebody who really dislikes religion or is not a huge fan of religion, according to his writings, but nevertheless feels that studying it is important, whereas some feel that they need to bring a critical eye to religious communities and religious practices and religious divisions, whereas other people come at it with a great love for the diversity and that sort of thing. So we all come at things from a different perspective, and it's good to look at a multiplicity of perspectives in order we can get a better idea or better grasp of what this word religion means. What if we put a die at the center? Then, you know, each person would be coming at it from different perspectives. That's the whole logic behind the phenomenological method. So, you know, we each see our different things. So if we understand where each person is coming from their perspectival starting point, and get at this question, what is religion, from a multiple different angles, then we get a better and better grasp of it. But we're always going to be leaving some things out, and we're always going to have some sort of biases trapped in there that we may not recognize. So part of this is, as we said before, to discover our presuppositions. So my point then is to show that Tillich, James, J.Z. Smith, and Tweed are all looking at religion from different perspectives. Your perspective might be different, and my perspective is probably different too. That doesn't mean that any of us is wrong, nor does it mean that any of us are right, or that all of us are right. It just means what it means. It means that each one of us perceives religion from a particular perspective, and if we stood somewhere else, things would look different. It's also helpful to notice, for what it's worth, that each one of these scholars kind of looks similar, right? They're all white men with beards, except for Tillich, but they're all white men. It's good to keep in account of whose voices are being left out, which perspectives are being left out, and it shouldn't be surprising if their definitions tend to ignore things like race, gender, and social privilege. Nevertheless, we got to start somewhere, so let's dive into some of these great theorists, and then we'll add our own 2 cents to it. So Paul Tillich was a Christian theologian and a philosopher. He died in, I think, 1965. He wrote, "Religion is the state of being grasped by an ultimate concern." That's a key phrase there, ultimate concern. Being grasped by an ultimate concern. A concern which qualifies all other concerns as preliminary, and which itself contains the answer to the question of the meaning of life. So he's saying that let's not say this ultimate concerns comes from our religion, but everyone has some sort of ultimate concern, whether it's just physical pleasure or getting rich or help making the world a better place or being a doctor or being a caregiver or environmental justice or racial justice. Whatever it is, there are these ideas, these things that grasp us. It's not so much that we're grasping onto them, but these ideas, these convictions just take hold of us. We're grasped by some sense of ultimate concern, and that really gets into how we think about everything else. This is exactly what Tillich was saying. So the answer to the question of the meaning of life, most of us have some kind of opinion or belief about it, but even if one believes that there is no meaning of life, that's still an answer to the question, what is the meaning of life? Note that Tillich describes religion as a state of being grasped by ultimate concern. It's as if being religious means being called to something, having some kind of mission that grasps you, some kind of mission that just won't let go of you. This is definitely the experience that many religious people have had, including myself, but certainly not everyone who considers themselves religious has had this kind of experience or this kind of conviction and experience. So let's think about what's left out of this definition. It doesn't mention rituals or ceremonies or religious practices or any of those kind of social aspects of religion, like the way people dress or the kinds of foods they eat, or even social celebrations and annual rituals like Christmas or Easter or New Year's or 4th of July, those kind of things. Those are certainly going to be a part or fit into one's ultimate concern, but definitely not for everyone who celebrates them. Tillich's definition is good. It's very good because it helps us to focus on how centrally important religious beliefs and religious practices and scriptures and things, those ultimate concerns, are for many people. It's something that gives meaning to every other part of their lives. But Tillich was a theologian. That's where he's coming from. His definition looks at religion from the perspective of theology, and thus leaves out all kinds of things that are of great importance to religious people, like rituals, practice, and society. Next is William James. So William James was an American psychologist who died in 1910. He gave a series of lectures in 1902, which were published as a book called The Varieties of Religious Experience, a study of human nature. He said, "Religion, therefore, as I now arbitrarily ask you to take it, shall mean for us." All right, before we keep going, I'm building you a list. One of them is going to be stipulative definition, or what he means here by we're going to arbitrarily take a definition. He's saying you can't really define the word religion, but I'm going to use the word religion. So in this book, for the sake of my theory, for the sake of what I'm putting forth, we're going to define it this way, right? And he's saying, well, it's somewhat arbitrary. You could argue with me over that, but don't argue over with me that. I'm just going to pick a definition and run with it so that we can get down to the nitty-gritty, which is to study people, right? The study of religion is the study of human persons. So what was he trying to say in this stipulative definition? Well, he says the feelings, the acts, and experiences of individual men and women in their solitude, so far as they apprehend themselves to stand in relation to whatever they may consider the divine. Note here that James is very careful with his words. He is not saying whether or not people actually are in some kind of relation with the divine. Instead, he states, quote, "so far as they apprehend themselves to stand in relation to whatever they may consider the divine." I emphasize this in part because in this class it's going to be very important for you to do, if you want to do well and get a lot out of this course, it's very important for you to try to withhold judgment about the religious beliefs of others. We aren't here to judge others, we're here to learn about others. And James here is also being very careful to say, I'm not bringing any sort of judgmental attitude. I may have some, but I am going to try and keep those in check and try and be aware of them and get rid of them as much as possible. But I'm going to try and study this as objectively and non-judgmentally as possible. I'm not asking you to believe what other people believe. I'm not asking you to question or reject what you believe or to dismiss it either. Instead, our task is to try and determine what kind of relationship to the divine other people, quote, apprehend themselves to have. James also said, we should stop thinking of terms like religion and culture as the name of for a thing and come to view them instead as a placeholder for a set of inquiries, which may be destined never to be resolved. So here, as we saw last time with Wilford Cantwell Smith, James is arguing that the word religion is not a name for some kind of thing that actually exists. Remember the quote, we're not here to study some thing called Buddhism, but instead to see the world, insofar as possible, through the eyes of a Buddhist. So likewise, James, who comes far before Smith, but certainly with a big influence on Smith, here James is arguing that the word religion is not the name for some thing which actually exists. We aren't talking about Christianity or Islam or Buddhism or any of these other made-up things. That's not what we are here studying. Instead, we are studying people, right? The study of religion is the study of human persons. For James, it's a study of human nature and of human experience. Instead of thinking about Christianity or Islam even as religions, it's better to think about the word religion as just a placeholder, as he says, for the kinds of questions that we want to ask. All right, so let's question again those motives, that starting point. So let's think about where James is coming from. Note that his definition of religion focuses on those psychological aspects of religion. So it leaves out a lot of social aspects and a lot of textual, leaves out text. He's not interested in studying text or that sort of theological method of studying, but he's really studying human persons from a psychological perspective and investigating, how what we call religious phenomena has some sort of effect on, people's psychological understanding of who they are and how they fit into the world. Those sort of things that psychologists are interested in. So what's left out? Well, there's no room for sacred scriptures or social practices or any number of human interactions, including family life and social life. Again, that doesn't mean that James's definition isn't useful to us. It's certainly useful to us. It simply means that it's important for us to keep in mind, as scholars of religion, that we each have our own perspectives and we each have our own biases. We each have our own blind spots. So, we can point out James's, blind spots, and we can point out Tillich's blind spots, and we can point out blind spots of all these other scholars. It's much more difficult to point out our own blind spots, so it's important to recognize that everyone has those. The farther we go around that phenomenological circle of looking at this idea of religion from as many different perspectives as possible, then we begin to understand and discover our own presuppositions, our own assumptions, our own biases, our own proclivities, or our own ignorance might be another term there. So there's a lot more to learn. It brings us a certain amount of humility, right? If these great scholars with their outstanding theories, building their life to kind of come up with one really concise, good, excellent definition of religion that has been very influential for the way many of us think. Nevertheless, they come at things from a very limited perspective, and we're leaving out so many perspectives of religious people, and also of a lot of minorities are left out, racial minorities, ethnic minorities, gendered minorities, sexual orientation. All these things are going to influence how someone looks at this phenomenon of religion. All right, next, let's come to this guy, Jonathan Z. Smith. He's a religious theorist and a historian of religion, and Smith rather boldly proclaims, quote, "If we had understood the archaeological and textual record correctly, man has had his entire history in which to imagine deities and modes of interaction with them. But man, more precisely Western man, has had only the last few centuries in which to imagine religion. That is to say, while there is a staggering amount of data, or phenomena, of human experiences and expressions that might be categorized in one culture or another by one criterion or another as religion, there is no data for religion. Religion is solely the creation of the scholar's study. It is created for the scholar's analytic purposes by his imaginative acts of comparison and generalization. Religion has no existence apart from the academy. Religion has no existence apart from the academy. Religion has no existence apart from the academy. All right, what does that mean? Okay, now I know that might sound like a pretty radical thing to say, but Smith is actually just saying the same thing that we've already seen before. There is no such thing as religion. Religion is a made-up category. It's a category that's been invented by scholars. That doesn't make it a bad category. That's the opposite of Smith's point. He wants us to study religion and to have courses in college just like this one, but he wants to make it very clear that religion itself does not exist. What exists are people. Instead, there are religious people. J.Z. Smith is trying to emphasize even more strongly what Wilford Cantwell Smith has already said. Quote, "The study of religion is the study of human persons." There's more that we could say about this, and I hope that you get the point. If not, then definitely ask me, because this is an important point. We are focusing on religious persons, and there is no such thing as Islam or Christianity or Judaism. These are all made-up categories. There are Christians and Muslims and Jews and Buddhists, etc. But those are people. We need to remain clear about that point. Last but not least, we come to Thomas Tweed, and a text that I usually assign for this course, but instead I'm just going to teach you all the things that you need to know about Tweed now, so we can get to some other readings and dive into these religious texts more quickly. So Tweed is a scholar whose focus is on anthropology. In his book, Crossing and Dwelling, he studies Christian immigrants from Cuba who live in Miami. As with all of the others that we've talked about, Tweed's definition reflects his particular perspective. He says, religions are confluences of organic cultural flows that intensify joy and comfort suffering by drawing on human and suprahuman forces to make homes and cross boundaries. Now, I already gave you a pretty good intro to this in an earlier lecture, so I'm not going to go into too much detail now, but just to give you a bit more about what he's trying to say. This isn't the kind of definition that I would expect anyone to memorize, but I do want you to understand what he's trying to say. Crossing and dwelling. I really want you to understand, when you think of Tweed, think of those two words, crossing and dwelling. So in his text on page 5, Tweed explains that he was looking for a theory of religion that made sense of the religious life of transnational migrants, right, the people he studied, and addressed 3 themes: movement, relation, and position. Let's look at those a bit more closely. First, religion can cause people to move across space, perhaps to go on a pilgrimage or on a mission trip, etc. But religion can also help people who have already moved across space to make a home. For example, the Cuban immigrants in Miami that Tweed writes about in his book and has studied extensively, they didn't leave their homeland because of religion. They left their homeland because of political, socioeconomic reasons. But their religious faith and their practices did help them to make Miami feel like a home. They ate together in communities, they spent time together, they told stories about home, etc. And because in this text he talks about the statue of Our Lady of Charity, the Virgin Mary, some of them brought this statue with them from Cuba to Miami. That statue of the Virgin Mary, Our Lady of Charity, also traveled with them from Cuba. So she, the statue, was also an immigrant. They felt that she had traveled with them and helped them to make Miami feel like home, a place where they belong. In the next text, we're going to read a little piece by Wilford Cantwell Smith, and he'll talk about this Tory. So you'll have a picture of your mind now of what a Tory looks like when we read it. But this gateway, this Japanese gateway, that's part of the Shinto tradition, you know, when you walk through that gateway, a psychological change happens because this space is sacred. For some people, when they enter a church or when they cross themselves with holy water or they enter a synagogue, put on the shawls or to fill in, lots of different things can mark those sacred boundaries. Religion can also help people to move through time. It may be as simple as marking the Sabbath each day of the week, or holy each year, or rituals such as Hajj, which mark movement through both time and space. So in terms of religion, religious communities, religious practices, religious communities, scriptures, traditions, rituals, all of those sort of things, they help to bind people together, bring people into community with one another. It creates a we. We'll talk more about that in a few moments. But also binds people to God or the divine, a sense of purpose, a sense of meaning, a sense of responsibility. And it also, religious traditions also help us to find our place. So that's part of what means by both relation and position, right? Finding ourselves in relation to others, in relation to non-human nature, in relation to ecology, in relation to our ethical responsibilities, our social responsibilities. And then finally, religion has something to do with position, according to Tweed. It encourages us to wander, it encourages us to explore and to dive deeply into the ancient wisdom of traditions different than our own. But one of the things that Tweed emphasizes in his text is the importance of wandering, the importance of just strolling. For example, if you go to New York City, I used to live in New York City, and people would come and visit me all the time. And anytime people would come to visit me, I would give them, they wanted me to show them around New York. And so I wound up having my own little tour agenda where we take the train down to Battery Park and we come up through Chinatown, through Financial District, and we'd make our way through pretty much the whole city in a day. Could check off lots of boxes. I saw this, I saw that. That's one way to go and experience a new place. But another way to experience a new place like New York is to just wander around. A lot of times after I moved there, I just wandered around. You just walk through the streets, and you would find all sorts of things that you never expected to see, that you weren't, and you found them because you weren't looking for them, if that makes any sense. So that sense of wandering, and so that maybe there's a play on words there between wandering and wondering. These kind of things that Tweed calls embodied travels and positioned representations. But simply, this wandering, this mental wandering, intellectual wandering, spiritual wandering, religious practices, and those sort of introspective practices and rituals and scriptures and things help people to wander within their mind, to think outside of the box, if you will, and to open their minds to discover their unique calling or place in this world. All right, so that's a pretty good phenomenology of the word religion. We're coming at this from the perspectives of lots of different straight white men in the West. But all of these are plagued by a certain kind of blindness, a certain kind of regulative blindness, where the topic of the concern has so consumed their focus that they are forgetting where they are coming from, and therefore how different things might look from a very different perspective. So we're going to look at two more, but then I'm really interested, hopefully through all of this, you found some things that were left out, so some things that, in maybe experiences you've had, either yourself or with people in your life and your family or others who are religious, that may bring yet more perspectives on what religion is and how we might define it, and through that begin to discover sort of the scope of our investigation.